So let me turn my comments for a few minutes to Washington and the challenges that we have there. About half of the industry's over $200 billion in sales are to the government, the Defense Department, NASA, FAA to some degree. So the pressures on government spending, the deficit, stimulus spending, war operations, and the focus on health care reform have a huge impact on the aerospace industry. At the same time, I've got a lot of confidence in the new team. And here I'm talking about everyone from Secretary LaHood, Transportation, Randy Babbitt at FAA, Eileen Tauscher, the new Undersecretary of State, who has really reached out a hand to us and said, we've got to do something about the problem of export controls. So I think we're seeing all of that, plus the new team at Defense. It's a solid team of committed professionals who are bringing a lot of expertise to the table. This is not a group of newbies. And I have to say, there's a lot of pressure and competition in D.C., which means we have to be very forward-leaning with our advocacy, because believe me, folks on the healthcare front and all that are taking up all the air in the room at the moment. And we've got to get some of that oxygen back. Focusing on defense for a moment. As you know, Secretary Gates, of course, remained on as what's known as a holdover from the Bush administration. I don't think holdover is really the right term, but because it doesn't imply the kind of confidence that he clearly has from the president. The president seems to be placing utmost confidence in him and his agenda in the way they want to transform, and I use that word advisedly, the Defense Department and how it does business. There are 2 points I'd like to make about the new defense team. First, we're extremely pleased about the dialogue between DoD and industry. It's opening up in a way that we have not had for many years. Before, it was a truly arm's-length relationship, and I think at this point we're really seeing things change. As an example, this summer, AIA released a study on the defense industrial base, and the door was wide open when we asked to meet with Undersecretary Ash Carter, Deputy Secretary Bill Lynn, and others to talk about this, because I do think this study is important to everybody in this room as well. And we did it because we felt there was not enough dialogue on the topic. The bottom line is that in the past, there really hasn't been an industrial-based strategy, or if there was, I'd call it a Walmart strategy. If you need something, you just go over to Walmart, and there the industry will be, able to provide it. Well, our report encourages the department to take into account the changes that have occurred in industry over the past decade as they're planning for the future. Because we've gone through years of consolidation, and we've also had a necessary focus in all of that, and in some cyclical times, on the focus on the shareholder and what we have to do from the standpoint of our own fiduciary responsibilities. We want to make sure that DoD understands that the next time it has a strategic requirement from industry and it goes to Walmart, the shelf may be very bare. And that's something that we don't take any pride in. But the fact of the matter is that we're going to have to work together to ensure that we maintain as a country the capabilities we need for the future. And this is something, as I say, that we're seeing a lot more dialogue on. In fact, I was delighted that the report has been held up multiple times on the floor of the House and the Senate, because people do believe that a positive reaction to this study can help influence the debate and the thinking as we see it reflected in the Quadrennial Defense Review, which, as you all know, is the department's strategic planning document, which is due out later this year. The second point I want to raise on defense has to do with the budget, and it's a piece of good news. The top line number for defense spending in the president's budget is about $540 billion. That's almost 4% of GDP. And that's about where we as an industry think we need to be as a nation, given the uncertain times we're in. However, a part of Secretary Gates' agenda is to reassess and, frankly, to shift how we prepare for different types of threats and systems and how we support our troops. I know everybody here has heard the debate, and this gets back to the QDR. What kind of war do we need to be prepared to fight? The current administration thinking is that while we can't ignore the threat of conventional warfare, what's known as near-peer Cold War strategies, at the same time, we've got to increase our focus on areas such as counterinsurgency and terrorism. Along with that, we still need the fifth-generation fighters, but there needs to be a different mix of systems, including much more reliance on unmanned aircraft and aircraft with characteristics better suited to counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And this is leading to a new focus on buying systems that can be procured quickly, that are relatively inexpensive to produce, and are based on existing older platforms rather than starting from scratch. And of course, an example of this is the newest Air Force combat aircraft procurement, the light fighter, which is capable essentially of multiple roles: strike, armed reconnaissance, advanced aircraft training for irregular warfare. The Air Force has announced that it's planning to buy 100 of these aircraft by 2012. Even a revamped Mustang, a version of the venerable World War II P-51, is one of the candidates that might be entered in the competition. Now, other examples are intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms. These are for programs that the Army Airborne Command Center, such as the Army Airborne Command Center, is putting an emphasis on. But this is the type of requirement that we think is likely to grow. So I emphasize this because I think it's a space that Wichita may want to watch pretty carefully. The defense marketplace is changing, and we're all going to be changing with it. Now, let me move on for a second, if I could, to talking about the civil aviation issues that I know are front and center here and are front and center on AIA's plate, believe me. And since I don't want to be here till dinner time, and I know we're on a tight schedule, I'll just highlight a couple of things if I could. The biggest challenge is funding for FAA. There's been a lot of debate and proposals on this, and as you know, with my previous hat on, I've certainly been front and center on a lot of them. I think the bottom line today is that we have to move forward with a funding system that's going to generate enough revenue to operate today's system and at the same time provide the capital investment to get us to NextGen, the new satellite-based aviation system that makes so much difference for our future. As an industry, we've got to advance a solution that works for all users of the system, and we at AIA are working very hard to do that. The FAA has been operating under a series of what are called continuing resolutions since 2007. It's had a particularly negative effect on this new iteration of technologies under NextGen because critical technologies have had to be delayed pending funding decisions. There are real strictures in what Congress allows you to do under a CR. We think it's important to fully fund FAA with the capital expenditures that are necessary for NextGen, and there needs to be a much more significant contribution from the U.S. Treasury's General Fund. Now, I say this because, in part, this is a new administration. It's a new way of thinking, and general taxpayer support is appropriate for our national airspace because all Americans benefit one way or the other from the services FAA provides. We all know that NextGen is going to bring huge benefits, and we're starting to see those benefits even now as ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, and new operational procedures are starting to be deployed across the country. NextGen, right now, is scheduled to be fully deployed in 10 to 15 years. But I and a number of other people who are leaning into this in Washington don't see why we can't accelerate that implementation to something more like 3 to 5 years. Those benefits are enormous and very tangible, and it's a perfect time. Traffic's down. There's going to be much less disruption to the system if we do it now, and frankly, the costs are going to be less. I mean, any of us know on a program, you pull it this way, and it's going to mean the cost per unit will be less, and in point of fact, FAA is having to operate a very archaic radar system, a lot of which will be supplanted by a new satellite-based system as soon as we're able to fly in it. However, the long pole in the tent that is the problem of equipping the civil air fleet with the avionics that are going to be necessary to fly in the system. And here I'm talking about not just the airlines, but I'm talking about business aviation and general aviation that flies in complicated airspace. What's it going to take to equip the civil fleet and implement the next gen on a much further to the right schedule? That's what we want to see. Well, at this point, further to the left schedule. First, I think we really are going to have to change the way we look at it and the way we talk about it. And what I mean by this is that the avionics we're discussing are as much a part of the National Airspace System infrastructure as our airports, runways, satellites, ILSs. All, I point out, taxpayer paid for. Taxpayer dollars were what we used to equip our current air traffic control system. And if you think of equipage on aircraft simply as air traffic control technology that's got to be installed there for the system to work, there are huge environmental and economic benefits that can be had once we put that technology in place. Government-supported technology, the purchase and the installation, makes a great deal of sense. Now, yes, this is an ambitious thing I'm advocating here, but I do think it's the right thing to do. Because if we're going to reduce the time it takes to implement the next gen, the obvious solution is to provide equipage options and incentives so that operators can shrink this gap and reap the benefits as soon as possible. How would you do it? There are a variety of things we can do. An infrastructure bank is one of the ways that I think, we might see some real progress on this. Good news on this, it's not, I won't tell you that this is a huge area of running room, but it's important. The House bill, in fact, has adopted language that has an infrastructure bank in it, and the administration has sent a letter forward and is supporting that. So we need to see if we can't get the Senate on board, and we need to make sure that the language about this bank has a real emphasis on aviation, because as usual, we tend to be the redheaded stepchildren behind the door when the crowd that's paving the highways and building the bridges is all out there. High-speed, trains, they're all doing pretty well. And we've got to be very aggressive in terms of making sure that we're provided for in this too.